Just an overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start with some general concepts and learn some maybe new terminology, as well as talk about pronoun use. Then we're going to go into some issues that face the trans community and why it's important to support trans people. I do want to warn you that in that section, we're going to be talking about some topics that can be difficult, including suicide and eating disorders. So if you need to step away at any point in the presentation, especially during these more difficult topics, feel free to do that and take care of yourself first. After that, we're going to talk about some ways to be supportive of trans people and the trans community. And at the end, we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions. And if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat throughout the presentation. But I won't be getting around to answering them until the end. So that's a little bit of information about me, but I'd also like to take a moment for some reflection about yourself. And these are just private reflections. You don't need to share them aloud or in the chat or anything, but just some questions to get the brain thinking, start considering some of these topics we're going to be talking about here together today. First question is, what is your gender? How do you know your gender? And when did you first become aware of it? What do you enjoy about being your gender? And are there gendered expectations that you do not enjoy? How was your concept of gender formed? And what messages were you given by society to inform your understanding of gender? We're going to take about a minute of quiet reflection to think about these questions. Obviously, a minute is not long enough to really dive deep into all of them, but just pick one or two that really kind of pique your interest. And we're going to spend about a minute reflecting on some of these things.
Alex, I just want to put it out there. I am a pediatric endocrinologist.
Oh, great. So another health professional here.
So I've dealt with genders, but still the pronouns are very new to me.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that. So I'm happy that you're here, and hopefully you're able to learn a little bit. If you have questions, again, feel free to share those.
Thank you.
Take about another half a minute or so of reflection. Okay, thank you everyone for thinking about some of those questions. Keep these questions in the back of your mind as we talk today and after the presentation is over. Keep thinking about some of these things and see if your thoughts about them have changed at all by the end here. To begin covering some concepts, we're going to start with the term assigned sex at birth. Someone's assigned sex is the sex classification that a child is given when they are born. Basically, it's what the doctor says when the baby is born, and they say it's a boy or it's a girl, and then they write that on your birth certificate. Usually that designation is based upon a person's external anatomy, the visible anatomy, but a person's sex is actually a combination of bodily characteristics, including chromosomes, hormones, internal and external reproductive organs, as well as secondary sex characteristics, which include things like facial hair or breasts that we use to differentiate between sexes. Most often, someone is either assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. Throughout the presentation, we're going to be talking about best use language, as well as some terms that we want to avoid when talking about these concepts. So for the concept of sex, we use the term assigned sex at birth, or sometimes you might hear designated sex at birth. And we say this because it makes it clear that that assignment has been put onto you by someone else, rather than it being something inherent to yourself. So you can compare assigned sex at birth with terms like biological sex, someone's real sex, or saying they're a real man or woman, or saying someone is born a man or born a woman, and how those terms imply that that's something innate to yourself rather than something that's been given to you by someone else. Some people think that male and female are the only two options of what you can be for your assigned sex, but the reality is that that's not accurate either. Some people are intersex, and intersex describes individuals whose sex characteristics do not align with the quote unquote typical male or female. It can include anatomical, hormonal, and chromosomal differences. And many people think, well, this is so rare, we don't need to worry about it or consider it, but it's actually much more common than you might think. The occurrence of intersex individuals is at a 1 in 100 rate, approximately, which, to put it to something that's a little more tangible, that's about the same rate as the number of people who have red hair. So if you think to yourself, how many people have I met, interacted with, or even just seen walking around the world with red hair? The reality is that you've known and seen a similar number of people who are intersex. You likely just did not realize that they were. Another note on language: in the past, this has sometimes been referred to with the word hermaphrodite. However, that term is outdated and not appropriate, and intersex is the correct term to use for this population. I also want to make a quick note that throughout the presentation, I'll have some photos of people who represent some of the communities we're talking about today. And all of them are great individuals to look up in your own time if you would like to learn more about any of these topics. They're all really great resources. Another concept that's important to know when thinking about sex and gender is gender identity. Gender identity is someone's internally felt sense of their own gender. It may be the same as their assigned sex, or it might not. But the most important thing to know about gender identity is that it's something that's not visible to other people. You can't just look at someone and know what their gender identity is, because it's only something that's internally felt. So that person is the only person who's able to know for sure what their gender identity is until they express and share that identity with someone else. So how these two terms come together to inform the trans community is that the word transgender is an umbrella term used to describe individuals whose gender identity, again, that's their internal felt sense, is different to their assigned sex at birth. Often this word is just shortened to trans, but it still just refers to transgender as a longer word. Transgender umbrella includes transgender men, who are individuals assigned female at birth, but whose gender identity is as a man. It includes transgender women, who are individuals assigned male at birth, whose gender identity is as a woman. And it includes non-binary people, which we're going to get more into what that means in just a moment. Again, a note on language: transgender is an adjective, and we can think of it being used just like every other adjective, right? It's just a descriptor for what type of person someone is. If you were trying to describe someone's height, for example, you wouldn't say that she is tall or he is a tall, right? You would just say she is tall or he is a tall man. It's the same with transgender. It's an adjective used to describe someone and not a noun. Therefore, we wouldn't say she is transgendered or he is a transgender. We would just say she is transgender or he is a transgender man. The word non-binary is also an umbrella term, and it describes people whose identities fall either partially or wholly outside of the categories of man and woman. This can be hard to understand if you've never questioned your own identity, or if it's an identity that you've never personally experienced. So in order to help us understand this better, I'd like to use an analogy that I learned from a speaker named Corey Will. And that is to think of the question, how many colors are there? Well, that question is kind of hard to answer, right? There's a lot of variables that go into how we perceive and define color. We might look at the wheel here and say, well, there are 12 colors. But where do we decide where the colors begin and end? What happens if we zoom in a little bit, like we have on the bottom color wheel? Now, all of a sudden, the answer to the number of colors that exist gets a lot more difficult. Where exactly does blue become green? Now let's bring in language and culture. In some cultures, they don't differentiate between green and blue. They're considered the same color and they use the same word for it. So how many colors are there then? In our language, we consider pink and red to be different colors, but not necessarily light blue and dark blue, even though isn't pink just light red? Why is that? It's because we decided in our culture and our language that that's how we were going to describe the colors. We could say there are 12 colors. We could say there are 1,000 colors, but neither one would be quite right because they would never be able to accurately capture every color and the way every culture perceives those colors. We can use this as a way to think about gender. In our culture, if we look at the top color wheel, we typically have two genders, men and women. But what happens if we zoom in on that the same way we did with the color wheel? Does every man perceive being a man the same way? Does every woman? And if we believe that gender is something that's internally felt and not based upon our physical bodies, then where exactly is the line between women and men? And as I said, in our culture, we have two genders traditionally, but in many other cultures, they have more. So what about those? Does green cease to exist if we don't call it green and we call it with the same word as blue? I know this is all a bit conceptual, but if we can expand our thinking just a little bit, we can realize that just like color, we can label gender in many different ways and never quite capture all the different experiences. The word non-binary is just a term to help expand our language in order to cover a broader range of experience. Non-binary people are very diverse in their expressions, identities, and experiences, may use any pronouns, they might transition medically or they might not. And if you've met one trans person overall, including one non-binary person, then you need to keep in mind that you've only met that one person and that other people with that same identity might have very, very different expressions and experiences. Another term that's important to know related to these concepts as we move forward is the term cisgender. Cisgender is used to describe someone whose gender identity, and that's the internal felt sense, aligns with their assigned sex at birth. In other words, someone who is not transgender is cisgender. As with transgender, this is just a way of describing someone. A woman could be transgender or cisgender. Both of them are women. These are just extra adjectives that we can use to better understand their experiences. As I said before, we don't want to use words like real woman or real man, because this implies that transgender people are not legitimate or real in their gender identities. Instead, we use the term cisgender. A concept that's related to gender identity but is different is gender expression. Gender expression is the physical expression of gender, such as your name, your pronouns, the way you dress, maybe some of your behaviors. But it's important to know that it's not the same as gender identity. People can express their gender differently, even if they identify as a certain thing that you might not expect given their gender expression. Just to give an example to this, a person's gender identity might be as a woman, but maybe she feels more comfortable in the gender expression being more masculine. For example, not being comfortable in dresses and preferring to wear pants, cutting her hair short. None of this changes that she identifies as a woman, even though her gender expression is on the more masculine end. Another concept that's a little bit related to some of these terminologies around gender, but is also distinct and different, is sexual orientation. Sexual orientation describes a person's physical, romantic, and/or emotional attractions, and it is separate from their gender identity. Transgender people can be any sexual orientation the same way that cisgender people can be any sexual orientation. Some important things to know are that transgender people's sexual orientation is based upon their gender identity, not their assigned sex. So for example, if a transgender woman is exclusively interested in women, then she might identify as a lesbian. If she is exclusively interested in men, then she might identify as straight or heterosexual. Attraction to transgender individuals is also based upon gender identity. So for example, in the picture here, Jamie on the right is a transgender man, and his partner Shaba is a cisgender, that is not transgender woman. Therefore, they are in a heterosexual relationship, not a lesbian one. So these are a lot of terms and they can kind of become confusing. So we're going to try and bring them all together to understand how all these things combine to create one person's identity. So we can do this by looking at the transgender unicorn. Some things I really like about this model is that each piece here is its own amount versus a spectrum with women on one end and men on the other, because a lot of people experience multiple things. I also like how it separates gender identity and expression and assigns sex, like we've talked about. It also separates physical and emotional attraction, because that can be different for people as well. So just to give us an idea of how this might work in practice, I asked a friend of mine to fill out the gender unicorn and let us look at it together and see how it describes them. If we start at the top, we can see that this person's gender identity is very low on the female, woman, girl spectrum. It's much higher on the male, man, boy, and also pretty high on other genders. We can compare this to their gender expression and see that there may be what we might describe as a little more androgynous in gender expression, with about midway up on all of them, although a little bit higher on masculine than the other two. This person is assigned female at birth. Physically, they find that they're attracted to everyone pretty much evenly, but we can again contrast that with emotional attraction, where we see that the person is much more attracted to women than to men, and is about in the middle when it comes to other genders. So again, just to reflect a little bit and help bring all these concepts together, I would like for you to take about a minute of quiet reflection. Again, that's just to yourself. You don't need to share this information with anybody else or put it in the chat or anything like that. But just take about a minute and see where you would place yourself on some of these scales. Okay, thank you everyone for taking some time to think about that. Maybe you found that this was really easy and you were able to mark yourself down right away. Maybe you found that it was a little more challenging and you weren't sure where to place yourself. Either way, I would encourage you to keep reflecting on some of these pieces of your own identity and keep thinking about how those identities inform your understanding of the world around you. To move on, we're going to talk about pronouns, which is something that people often have a lot of questions about. So again, I'll remind you that we'll have questions at the end. You're welcome to put them in the chat now if you have them, but we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. Pronouns are a set of words that a person wishes to be referred to as in order to reflect their gender identity. Some examples of common pronouns are he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, but there are also more options for pronouns beyond just these three. Some of those other options are called neopronouns, and neopronouns are a set of pronouns that are not officially recognized within a language that do not specify a gender. Some examples of neopronouns include ze, here, heres, and am, airs. So just as an example of how we might use some of these pronouns, Maya, the author here, uses am, air pronouns. So I might talk about M saying, I read air book. I thought A did a great job of describing air experiences. That would be an example of how we would use some of these words in a sentence. In order to dive into usage a little bit more, there's a chart here on the screen right now that you can see where the top row, well, I guess the second row after the titles, gives some sentences. The columns beneath it show which pronoun, how each pronoun would fill that sentence in usage. So if we're trying to practice using this chart, we want to learn more about how to use they, them pronouns, we could look at the second row from the bottom and fill in the sentences with those words. So we would say, they are a volunteer. I am proud of them. That is their book, or that book is theirs. And that person likes themselves. And we can fill in those sentences with any of the pronoun sets that we have listed here, although this certainly isn't an exhaustive list of everything that someone could possibly be. When it comes to using pronouns that are new to you or that you're less familiar with, my biggest piece of advice is just practice, practice, practice. The more you practice using a pronoun that's new or unfamiliar to you, the easier it will become, and the more that you'll find yourself able to use it naturally without having to think really hard about it. Some great ways to practice are just to do some people watching. Go to the mall or a park or your library, and in your own mind, as you're looking at the people around you, just practice using a different pronoun. As we've said, you can't assume someone's gender identity just by looking at them. So instead of looking at someone and assuming that they are a man, maybe you say, I'm just going to assume that they use ze, here, heres pronouns and practice using those in my own thoughts as I'm looking around the room. Another piece of advice that I have is to always be conscious of referring to someone by their chosen pronoun, even if it's just in your own thoughts. Sometimes people think, well, I'm not really comfortable with this pronoun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of this person by, say, she, her, hers pronouns in my mind. And then whenever I speak, I'll correct myself in order to use the correct pronoun. The reality is that as we get talking and the conversation is flowing, if you're not being conscious about using the correct pronoun, even in your own mind and your own thoughts, you're going to slip up and make a mistake and say the wrong thing aloud. It's just how our brains work. If you do make a mistake, the best way to address it is to say a quick, I'm sorry, correct yourself, and then move on with the conversation. So that might look like saying, oh, I don't know, you should go talk to him. Sorry, I mean, you should talk to them about that. And just moving on with the conversation. The reason we handle it that way is because entering a profuse apology, saying things like, I'm so sorry, this is just so new to me and I'm not used to it yet, I didn't mean to make a mistake, and kind of going on like that, does two things. The first is that it puts a big spotlight on the person who's just had the wrong words used for them and elevates the level of discomfort that person feels instead of alleviating it. The second thing it does is it puts that person into a position of needing to comfort you and say, it's okay, I know it's hard, when in reality, they are the person who has been hurt in this situation and it shouldn't be on them to comfort you. So again, the best way to address it is a quick, I'm sorry, correct yourself, and then continue on with the conversation and not dwell in that moment.
Alex, can I ask a quick question? I'm sorry, because I do have. Now, when somebody put their name and then she put she, and then, or another person put their name and will write she/her, and then a third person will put their name and write she/her/hers. What are the differences and why? What does it mean?
I think I understand what you're saying. It's just that some people will put a different number of the the variations of that pronoun in their
Yeah.
names.
Yeah.
That means that they use that set of pronouns. Some people like to list them all out, especially if maybe they use neopronouns that someone are not familiar with, so that everyone has the full set. And then sometimes for brevity, people will put just she, her, or they, them, instead of listing out all three of them. But it just means that that person, regardless of how many of them they list, uses that set of pronouns.
Okay, so it's not an more affirmation, it's just a choice.
Yeah, that in terms of how many of the pronouns within a set of pronouns they list, it's just a personal choice of how they choose to write it.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Sometimes you will though see people who have multiple pronouns. So maybe it says, he/they. If that's the case, the person uses both sets of pronouns, and it's really supportive and great for that person if you try your best to use both sets of pronouns and not just defaulting to she or he, and the one you're more comfortable with. So that's another variation of seeing multiple pronouns listed that you might have encountered before.
Yeah,
okay. Oh, sorry. Did you have another question?
No, you clarified it. Just as I said, I've seen these host of things, and I didn't know whether it's somebody affirming, or it could be a choice, just name and she, name and he and hers, and name and she and he and her. I mean, sort of the three of them together.
Yeah, so some people might use multiple pronouns. Some people might just use one, but list it differently. So
Thank you.
Hope that answered your question. I'm gonna piece of terminology here, which is around transition. Transition is the process that someone goes through to move from a presentation that would be maybe assumed given their assigned sex at birth towards presenting in a way that more closely resembles their desired expression for their gender identity. So transition has three sort of subcomponents to it. The first is social transition. Social name, your pronouns, your clothing, things like that. All of the social transition pieces are usually things that can be done completely on your own without, assistance from an outside entity. The second category is medical transition. And I think this is what people often first think of when we talk about transition, but it's actually just one sub piece of it. Medical transition includes things like hormone therapy and surgery, which you would get from a medical healthcare provider. The final category is legal transition, and that might include changing your legal name or changing your gender marker. And for anyone who's not familiar with what a gender marker is, on your driver's license or your passport, right, we all have an M or an F saying what our sex is on those identity documents, and that's your gender marker. And trans people are sometimes able to get that marker changed. It can be a really difficult process in some places. Some places it's easier than others, but often it can be a lot of work and effort to go through that process of getting it changed. So I would encourage you, if you ever see legislation around making that project easier, to voice your support for it in order to help people be able to make that change. Because if you think about how often you present your ID documents, it's pretty frequent, and it's often in situations where it could open you up to discrimination or harassment if it doesn't look like what someone might assume that it was. So for example, if you're providing your new ID documents when you start a job and your gender marker says F whenever someone might assume that you were a man, that can open you up for discrimination at your job if they maybe weren't aware of your transgender identity. So I want to just wrap up the transition piece by saying that not all people will transition in any or even all of these ways. So counter to the narrative you might be familiar with, many trans people do not medically transition or only wish to do certain aspects of medical transition, such as choosing to do hormone therapy but not do surgery. So it's really a diverse set of people who pick and choose from these categories in order to do what feels the best for them. And it's not necessarily true that everyone will do all of it. So now we're going to move into why does this matter? Why are we even talking about this at all? And this subjects, we're not going to go into great detail, but we will be touching on some of them. So if you need to step away, feel free to do so. If trans people are not supported, we see much higher rates of suicide and suicidal ideation, which is contemplating suicide. We see higher rates of depression and anxiety, of eating disorders, and also really high rates of homelessness and employment discrimination. We're not going to get really deep into every single one of these, but I do want to dive a little bit deeper into a couple of them. First one is those mental health pieces. In the 2015 US Transgender Survey, which surveyed almost 30,000 transgender people in the United States, it found that 39% of trans adults are facing serious psychological distress at any given time. And we can contrast this against only 5% of the general population to see the huge disparity between those two numbers. 48% of trans people have experienced suicidal ideation, and that is, again, thinking about suicide in the past year, versus only 4% of the general population. And 7% of trans adults attempted suicide in the past year, versus only 0.6% of the general population. So if we look at this, we can see the huge gap between the numbers of people experiencing these things in the trans community versus in the more general US population. I also want to highlight the issue of trans people experiencing homelessness. 1 in 3 trans adults have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives, which is a really, really high number, especially for such a small community. And 1 in 8 have been homeless in the last year. To make this even worse, 70% of trans adults who stayed in a homeless shelter reported some form of discrimination or abuse. And that could be anything including verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. It could be including being completely denied access to shelter because of their transgender identity. So there's a really, really high number of people in the trans community experiencing homelessness, and it's much more difficult for them to receive the same services that cisgender people are able to seek out. These are obviously very concerning things, but what can we do to help and to be supportive of the trans people in our lives? Some really encouraging news is that the Trevor Project did a survey and found that having just one accepting adult can reduce the risk of suicide for a queer youth by 40%, which is a huge, huge reduction in suicide risk. Another really encouraging thing about this project was that they found that person does not necessarily need to be a parent of that child. It can just be any, like a different family member, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent. It could be a teacher or a counselor at school or a coach or a family friend, just someone in that child's life who is affirming and supportive of them. So how can we be the accepting and supportive person in someone's life? We're going to start out with some do nots, and then we're going to move into some things that I would recommend you do. The first do not is do not ask unnecessary and invasive questions about their body or their life before transition. Some examples of unnecessary questions, or what genitals they have, which might stick out to you and say, well, why would you ask someone that? But it's actually very common for trans people to be asked about their genitals and their bodies. So ask yourself, do you really need to know? And are you asking these questions of other people, like a random coworker or neighbor? Other information that's commonly asked about, but that you don't need to ask on, is what their former name was, or asking to see a before picture from before their transition. Both of those are really invasive questions, just not ask. Another do not is do not ask about their plans for any transition steps unless you are invited to discuss it. So don't ask them if they are getting or have had surgeries, for example. If they initiate a conversation with you or share that they're planning to take a transition step, the appropriate response is to support them, congratulate them if that makes sense in the context of the conversation, and then keep that information to yourself. Don't assume that because they shared it with you, that it's okay for you to then share it with other people. Another do not is do not use their former name, which is sometimes referred to as a dead name in the trans community, even if referring to something that happened before their transition. So once you know a person's chosen name, the only time it's acceptable to use their former name is if they have explicitly told you that they are not out and open to everyone in their lives about their identity, and that they don't. If you're unsure about whether or not that's the case, you can always ask the person if they are comfortable with that name being used in front of everyone or not. Assuming that they do indeed want it used, never use their old name. And that includes things, saying things like, oh, my friend John, who used to be Jen. We don't need to share their former name in any context. Moving away from the do nots into things that are do's that get a thumbs up, we do want to use someone's chosen name and their pronouns. Again, with the stipulation that if the person is not open to everyone, consult with them first before using their name. Another do is to correct yourself and others if a mistake is made. And again, correcting yourself is a brief apology, correction, and moving on with the conversation. It's also really hard to speak up for yourself constantly. So having someone else correct on your behalf is saying to someone who has just used the wrong name, I think you mean Sarah, or actually it's Sarah, and just doing a quick correction to let someone else know that they need to adjust their language. Finally, a person can't correct other people or speak up for themselves if they're not in the room, if they're not present. So if you hear something that is wrong, speak up, correct other people, speak up when someone is making disparaging or ignorant comments about trans people, and be that person's advocate and their ally, even if they are not around to see or hear you do it. The previous 3 points are really where I would recommend you start if this is new to you and if you're not comfortable yet, either using someone's name and pronouns consistently or correcting other people who have made mistakes. That's really where I recommend you focus your efforts first. If you find that you are comfortable with different names and pronouns and with correcting other people, and you feel confident in your ability to do that, that's where you can move into some of these other ways to be supportive. And that is to provide gender neutral facilities such as bathrooms or locker rooms. Gender spaces can be really challenging for trans people and can be a source of stress and potential harassment. And so giving someone the option of using a gender neutral facility can be really supportive and great for that person. Reviewing policies to increase inclusion and protection from discrimination is also important. And making sure that the anti-discrimination policies explicitly state that discrimination based on someone's gender identity or transgender status is not permitted. Finally, reviewing organizational materials, such as things like intake forms or how you collect your data, in order to make sure that they are inclusive and affirming of transgender people. Some great places that you can look into asking about some of these things include your workplace, your child's school, maybe an establishment that you go to frequently, such as your gym, and just asking someone in charge of those facilities, what what are the policies around trans people coming and using this space? What kind of supports are available to them? What do the materials look like? What do the facilities look like? Bringing these things up, even if a transgender person isn't in that space at this time, is really great, because as trans people, we get used to having to fight these battles every single time we go somewhere. So if somewhere else has already thought about this, already make sure that they are an inclusive space before a transgender person ever walks through the door, that can be really, really great for that person. One thing I will note is that it's important to make sure that if you're going to be making any big changes to any of these things, that you consult with a transgender person for those changes, rather than just making an assumption of what you think a trans person might need. With that, I just want to provide some further resources in case you're interested in learning more about any of these topics. These are some books I would really recommend. On the far left, we have the ABCs of LGBT, which is a really great introductory book if you're still getting used to some of these identity terms and concepts around gender and gender identity. The middle two books, Sorted, Growing Up, Coming Out, and Finding My Place, and Redefining Realness, My Path to Womanhood, Identity, and So Much More, are two memoirs written by a transgender man and transgender woman, respectively, and talking about their own experience, as well as providing more education about the trans community and how their experiences sort of fit into common things experienced by the trans community. On the far right, we have Beyond the Gender Binary, which is a book that is specifically about non-binary. Learn more about, I would recommend checking that book out. If you're not so much a book person, we're here at the library presentation, so hopefully you do like to read, but if you're more of a movie person, that's okay. There's a film on Netflix, which is called Disclosure, which I highly, highly recommend people watch in order to learn more about trans issues. It's about trans representation in the media and how that representation informs not only cisgender people's view of transgender people, but also trans people's understanding of ourselves. It's a really great movie, although I do want to warn you that there are some adult topics and images that are shown, as well as if you are a trans person or you're thinking about watching this with a trans person, there are some things in that movie that are really, really difficult for trans people and might be uncomfortable and really hard to watch. So just know that going into the movie. Finally, there's some really great organizations that I recommend you check out if you're looking for more support. In the Boston area, there's Fenway Health, which is a clinic focused on LGBT health. And they also operate the National LGBTQIA+ Health Education Center, who offers a lot of free webinars and trainings that I really, really highly recommend you check out if you're looking for more information about any of this. There's also the Trans Student Educational Resources Center, which created the Gender Unicorn and created some other really good resources as well. And finally, the National Center for Transgender, for more information about legislative and legal issues around trans identity and trans people. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming today and for participating. And I'm going to open it up to questions if you have any questions that have come up throughout the presentation.